All right, kids, Mr. Callahan again. We are in Chapter 2, Economics and the Global Economy. This video is the economy and global trade. Our enduring or essential question is, what is the government's role in supporting and stabilizing the economy? How do these actions impact your personal finances? What we want to do is describe three basic goals of the economy. They're relatively simple. Want to describe some economic indicators and their significance. Discuss segments of the business cycle that we already touched upon. Examine the reasons nations trade with one another. Quickly explain the balance of trade. And compare free trade and protectionism. The goal of every economy is very simple: economic growth, stable prices, full employment. We have economic indicators that I believe you've heard before. Gross domestic product is the GDP, and that's all goods and services produced inside a country. GNP is what's produced. Its gross national product is produced by US companies. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is the cost of goods and services published monthly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Inflation is an increase in prices. Deflation is a decrease in prices. All right, that's relatively self-explanatory. The unemployment rate is the percentage of the workforce actively seeking employment. Excellent. Here's the CPI. Here's a couple of graphs about the CPI. This is all data that economists use. All right, I don't expect you to know every portion of it or everything that happens, but it usually, the CPI goes with the economy. If the economy is booming, the CPI goes up. If the economy is in recession, like around 2009, 2010, it will generally go down and then catch up somewhere along the line. Okay, so they are some graphs that you will see during the term in this course. Business cycle, and I don't know if you've all been through one yet, but a business cycle is a peak, a trough, and then another peak. Okay, and it just looks like a wave. Okay, so we have it may start out as recession, which is under the potential GDP. Once we hit the bottom of the trowel and it starts to recover, it's called a recovery. All right, then it may peak and go into another trough, which is a recession. And then the recovery will be called a boom until it peaks, and then there's a downturn, and then there becomes another recession again. Okay, expansion, contraction, peak, trough, recovery, recession, depression. Consumer spending, business investment, and employment all relate to this. Okay, if there is expansion, then consumer spending expands, business investments expand, employment goes up, the unemployment rate goes down. All right, if we are in the recession, that means there's a downturn. If it's longer than 6 months, it may be called a depression. When it contracts, then consumer spending contracts, business investment contracts, the unemployment rate goes up. So the government can intervene. They can use tax reductions to stimulate spending. They can use incentives for businesses to hire workers. They can train the unemployed or raise interest rates to discourage borrowing. You may have heard of the New Deal, which was back and was supposed to be a cure-all for the Great Depression. And that's when Social Security came into play and the SEC was founded. TARP was the Troubled Asset Relief Program during the banking crisis of 2008. And what happened was the government bought up troubled assets. All right, if there were bad investments that a bank made, our US government bought them, bailed them out, if you will, took those troubled assets off of their balance sheets and put them on the government balance sheet. There was a Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which helped consumers and the unemployed. All right, regarding trade, there is a division of labor, and I think you know about specialization if you've taken a history course. Division of labor is that tasks are divided among different workers to increase productivity. The best form of division of labor was the assembly line, and I'm sure that you have studied that or at least had some exposure to it. International trade, anything that we buy from another country is called an import. Anything that we send over to another country is called exports. There has been increased competition due to international trade. It has improved the standard of living across the world. Why do nations trade? And that's one of our main questions. Goods can be produced more efficiently in other countries depending on their resources. There may be scarcity of natural resources, which creates interdependence among nations. Some countries have an absolute advantage. Think of the Caribbean countries and the places where there's nice weather. They can grow fruit, all right? Up in Vermont and up in northern Canada, you know, you have to import all your fruit up there, all right? And if you're in Saudi Arabia, you have plenty of oil to export, but you don't have a whole lot of, let's say, ice cubes, all right, or ice cream. So you have to import all of that stuff if you're living in a desert, and water, all right? Comparative advantage and absolute advantage, I believe we'll cover in the next slide or in the next section. Per capita means per head or per person, quite simply. The GDP per capita is a basic indicator of a country's economic well-being. GDP measures the value of all goods and services produced within a country. So we do not have the highest GDP. Norway does, followed by Singapore, and then there's the United States. All right. The country with the highest GDP, like I said, is Norway, and one with the lowest GDP is the Czech Republic. You can see that the black designates folks that are pretty well off. The GDP is huge, all right? Some countries are not so well off, so if you get to the under 25K, you can see some pretty poor countries, Sri Lanka, okay? Morocco, Libya because of the crisis in Libya right now, Bangladesh, all right, pretty poor countries. So individuals trade skill for wages. All right, I am a teacher. I have a skill. My skill is teaching. I work every week for the school district of Westchester, and they trade wages for my skills. Organizations trade goods and services for revenue. All right, so businesses trade their goods and services for revenue. So when Kmart or Walmart sells something and you buy something, you are buying a good, trading them a piece of cash or a credit card or debit card. You're giving them money for the goods or service. Nations trade with other nations for resources. Okay, that's basically why we trade with other nations. Pretty easy stuff. Okay, very obvious. If exports are greater than imports, we have a trade surplus. If imports are greater than exports, there's a trade deficit. Trade deficits must be funded by debt. Okay, so we have to borrow if we're in a trade deficit. When we talk about free trade, we mean free trade that there are trade agreements between countries. There are no economic principles, no regulations. They can come across the border with their goods and sell it here, you know, without incurring any type of tariff. So there is NAFTA, the EU, the World Trade Organization. All right, and they want fair trade among member nations. Protectionism is kind of what our current administration is trying to engage in now. They're trying to restrict trade and protect domestic industries. Our fearless leader has put tariffs on Chinese imports and quotas on Chinese goods. And but the only embargo that is currently in place, I believe, is still the embargo on Cuba. So you will see no Cuban cigars in the United States because we have an embargo. Look these things up: tariff, quota, and embargo. They are key terms. We don't have any imports from Cuba since the late 60s. All right, so there's NAFTA. You can see that we have a trade deficit. Trade deficit with Canada. We have a trade deficit with Mexico. And Canada has a trade deficit with Mexico. So it's not out of the ordinary to have trade deficits. All right, we went through this before. In a market economy, the economic flow of resources and goods is circular. All right, savings, taxes, the federal government, the government borrows from banks and institutions, the government spends on businesses, the government spends to individuals, they employ individuals. We put our savings into banks, businesses borrow from the banks, and so do individuals. There's your income and purchases going around the top and the bottom. So inputs are investment, equipment, human capital, raw materials, technology, and training. And then there is productivity, which equals output, high quality, high quantity of products for sale, which equals higher profits, which is key. So back to our original question. So analyze it again, look at the video again. What is the government's role in supporting and stabilizing the economy, especially the U.S. economy? And how do these actions impact your personal finances? This is a personal finance class. So all of these questions are going to have to do with your personal finance. Thanks so much, and I'll see you for Chapter 3.